Hello,
Hola, Lula.
¿qué tal? Fine?
¿Se ven?
Let me see if I'm recording. I'm recording. I hope I am. Okay.
Veo muy bien. Excelente.
Sí, ¿todo bien?
Sí, más o menos como viviendo, tratando de vivir, tratando de aguantar, ¿no?
Are you completely, you can go for walks or you are completely,
Actually isolated, sheltered, all the appropriate words. Yeah, I do go for bike rides. I go for walks, but not much more.
yeah, but that makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, but you have the sea. I wish I had
No,
the sea. Oh, no? I thought no, you don't see the sea.
in Bristol.
Oh, I thought you did see the sea. Ah, okay.
It's not far the sea, but not so close to see it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it actually is great to be able to bike by, the west side or the east side, the rivers. Makes a big
Yeah.
difference to see the water. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes a difference because in Spain, my family and that they completely locked down. So that
Yeah.
is when
Yeah.
I think these things happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I got a lot of questions, but
Oh.
doesn't matter. I start and then I think we need to.
Well, I was thinking how great this is, the randomness of this, particularly because before I met you, when I first saw your work, and included you in the project with Rawview, women looking at women. Of course, I didn't know you at all. And so that was like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you joined Magnum. And since you joined Magnum, I barely see you anyway. So
Yeah.
it's kind of strange to have a conversation after all this time.
It
Yeah.
is nice. It is nice. I thought that is very interesting. The randomness is just very, I like that mystery. And
Yeah.
also, I found really interesting. I was thinking, this we talking, there's no camera recording us,
Mm.
but this is going to be seen by people. Yeah, so it's really, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Again, randomly, random people,
Yeah,
people you
quite.
don't know and you'll never know, maybe, or some that you
Yeah.
do know. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway.
Okay. So my first question is, I got them here written down. What made you dedicate your life to photography, and specifically to documentary photography and the topics you have been working with? Where do you think that sensibility come from?
Lua, that's like a journalist would ask that question.
Really?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't my plan at all. I mean, I didn't really have a plan going into
Yeah,
think
but that sensibility, where do you think it comes from?
um hmm that's a difficult question because there's so many influences. We were talking about rivers, it's like rivers of experiences coming together, and then suddenly there's an opportunity and you respond, and it takes a long time to even understand what that was, because there wasn't that intentional uh actually somebody just told me a term yesterday, NATO. What was it again? It's not with an objective in mind, essentially. How do you living your life without projecting, like
Mhm.
a fisherman in the river who throws a big line, is after a fish, he doesn't know what it'll get, but he pulls it in. That's a kind of intentional life. Or you go into the stream and you just wade your way. I was wading in, so I did. When I went to college, there was no photography. They didn't teach photography. It was a women's college, and then I did get very interested in education early on. And education, at that time, there were a lot of people talking about visual literacy. Ironically, that's what they're talking about now again. But at that
Mm.
time, that was a kind of mysterious thing. What was that? And how would photography play a role? So I kind of think I got hooked in by that question, and then discovered that photography is such a wonderful way to engage with the world, and that's just become my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very different time, and I know your experience has been different too, you know, in some ways much more intentional, you know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
also the difference of time. And maybe that's also part of even why the work I do with Magnum Foundation is trying to give people opportunities who would never have had that. I mean,
Hmm.
it's kind of like it opened up a world to me, and it's a way of really a way of living. And that's, I think, tied very much to what's happening now, because most of us as global travelers are pulled away from the world. We're seeing the world through mediated experiences of others, like many others have done with our work. And that's a very hard process to renegotiate yourself. In other words, to not be in the center of, not be drawn to, not be inside what's happening in some ways, which many of us have done in different ways over the
Yeah.
last decades.
Mm.
I feel very pulled away and forced into a kind of cocoon that's never been my instincts in life, you know. It's always been to go out, not to stay within.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you if you have, like, recently, I always get lost, like many times when I'm editing, when I'm working, I'm I'm constantly questioning, like, and sometimes, no, you get really confused with that. And but I learned slowly that I got some things to come back, some initial inspirations that are always there, and I always come back. No, this can be, I don't know, a couple of artists or maybe a writer. They are, I don't have a list, but sometimes I connect with them and it's like, okay. And somehow all the other worries go a little bit and there's a little bit of clarity, no? And I wanted to ask you if you have that, and if you want to tell me like
You
one
know,
reference.
I yeah, well, it's interesting. The idea of being lost. I would put it differently. I would say it's more about allowing yourself to not know. So it's a little bit different than I don't know that I feel lost. I can feel overwhelmed by things that I've initiated that are just way bigger than I could ever have imagined I'd find myself in the midst of, you know. And that there's an obvious example of that with the Kurdistan project, because it was really a shift of practice. I, it wasn't anything I planned on. I didn't preconceive it. It kind of evolved being in the field, and then suddenly I was in the midst of this massive research project that took almost 7 years and took me off my track. So when you talk about tracks, you can talk about desvios, you know, the
Sí.
place that you're kind of going down that little alleyway and you don't know what's on the other side. It could be a dead end, but you kind of have to go. And so it became this winding road up many mountains and down valleys and suddenly, and I used to have this image of myself kind of carrying a stone on my head that got heavier and heavier, but I couldn't stop and I couldn't put it down or I'd never pick it up again. And I just had to kind of move through it. And it was painful in many ways because I had no idea what, you know, I had some sense of the motivation. I was completely inspired with every little something I found, like making a collage or an assemblage, every little piece of a jigsaw puzzle. That part of it was very rich. But then when I stepped back and I realized, but what is this and who am I to do this? Talk about big questions. And of course, being reassured, and you work collaboratively too, you know, you're reassured by a community you're working with. And in some ways, you're working for, because in some ways, I was able to do things that they themselves didn't have access to. So it's kind of became a very kind of, again, very experimental for me, very outside of anything I'd done, though there were resonances of earlier projects that only kind of midway through I realized there were roots in other ways that I had in my own kind of body history that I was bringing back. And, you know, that's it. We don't have time for all of that, but that's, you know, that was a big discovery, and it came way, way late in the process. So what I'm saying is the term lost, or feeling like you don't know, but you're still propelled because you feel you just have to keep going. And that stone on my head, it was a real strong image. And I could see the women I've seen carrying water in Latin America, or stones on their heads in Africa. I was like all of them, just not knowing, just having to keep in motion, because motion carries you forward, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. When yeah, I was listening again to the Carnival strippers, like the audios that impacted me very much the first time I hear them, because of those existential the questions that they made for themselves, that you completely identify as a person, as a woman, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and also that's another interesting thing, because people kind of didn't understand why, when I, you know, it was very early and I insisted on showing the photographs with the sound when I first showed the work in the early 70s. And that was even before there was a book. And I, you know, then I struggled with the difference of a written text and the emotionality of these voices. So, you know, it took 30 years to be able to make a book that had the CD-ROM in the back and you could bring these two things together. But, you know, it was before I thought about multimedia even, you know, but it was in space and voices, which was really a recreation of what I was experiencing when I was in those little, you know, boxes of their, you know, the Mack trucks that were carrying the women in the dressing rooms. I was hearing all these incredible exchanges and thoughtfulness and truth, their truth, the comfort of their own truth telling, you know, not performing for anyone, of course, as they did with their bodies, but just sharing those feelings was so intense.
Yeah, but in terms of the sound being on alongside the work, you know, I can be quite purist about the images, and that was the first time that I thought this actually is possible with photographs, and it elevates it and makes it much more deeper. But then also I thought this is not always easy, and it's not for it. I think it worked particularly well in that story, in a way that I think it's also delicate, and I mean, to add multimedia, I think it's complicated. That's what
Well, I would say I don't look back at any one thing I've done and necessarily take the same strategy or approach into something else. You know, I think in a way that's what has made my work hard to explain to people, because it's like a zigzag, you know, when I go back and look. I mean, I don't know that even with Prince Street Girls, which was the project that was right around the same time as Carnival Strippers, those girls were too young. They didn't yet have, you know, at 8 years old, 9 years old, they would just giggle when we would talk. You know, they weren't projecting even the way their bodies were starting to present themselves, you know, and pose for each other. That was very intuitive, but they didn't have a theory about it. You know, they were just being themselves. And they, you know, I've talked to them obviously many, many times since that period. I regret that I didn't find a way to capture really that inner staging of their selves. You know, I didn't find a way to, other than the imaging. You know, there are a few little notes here and there that they sent me, but we didn't capture reflections. And so you have to, I mean, you adapt to what the relationship is and what it generates, and what form you create in that exchange.
And it's interesting because I feel, I don't know, I guess it's the same for many of us, that I, for example, work completely from that intuition and that instinct. And then later on is when you which is quite a painful process, when you find the theories that might be created to apply to those situations, or the other kind of structures that are more articulated for what you experience. But I think it's so interesting to experience on the first person, because no one can tell you what's truth or what's not, because you already know. So I feel that that's a very interesting part of our job.
Yeah. And also there's, well, we maybe have, you know, it's sort of stretching the rubber band in a way, because, you know, I think of the spectrum in documentary practice, and sometimes you're very aware that when people are performing for you, when you want them to, in your case, and where I try to work in the reverse. I kind of want to be invisible. I want to wait until I see a moment. I never ask people to repeat or reenact themselves, but I can see incredible work done when people do that. It's just who you are. You have to be who you are also in relation to the subjects you work with and the kinds of relationships you evolve. Because, you know, I love seeing some of what you've done, and Carolyn Drake, and of course, because intensity of relationship with Agatha, you know, these are very special, very unique, very much about each person in a particular moment with, be it an individual or a community of people, you know, and you have to feel your way. It can't be imposed. You know, when I worked with the domestic violence shelter in the UK, it was a completely different situation, because there were, you know, all the concern of the stigma, all the concern of the identity. So the huge breakthrough for me was just women inviting me into their rooms, their most sacred space, and not being present, but every object in their space a reflection, like a mirror of who they were in that moment in time. So that was a collaboration that doesn't reveal that intimacy, but they almost could look like anyone went in and just said, oh, I'll, it was a concept, but it didn't happen that way for me. It happened magically the moment that a girl said, "Do you want to see my room?" And that took weeks before that offer came. And, you know, I would never have said, "Can I?" It was, "Do you want to?" And that invitation is fundamental difference to the whole process that then unfolds. And then you try and find the right way represent what has been special in that very moment, you know.
That's very interesting that you say that, because I realized that I like to go to challenging places and to go into situations that I wanna look and well, but I always like to achieve that point when you are asked for when you are invited, no, and when you're ready, you feel like you know, you have gained certain. I don't know where I read once or where I saw once that, I think it was John Berger, that said that people is extremely intelligent, we all are, and perceptive, to know that if your interest is genuine. And I really like that, because a lot of sort of magical situations happen when we go to places, and sometimes it's, that's really special.
And there's so many ways that gets expressed. The way you look at someone, how close you feel you can stand, how you hesitate, you know, when you sit, whether or not you drink their tea, or, you know, any number of things that can, you know, receive the welcome and reciprocate in some way, you know. And then reciprocity is a whole nother aspect of, I'm sure in your practice too, you know, finding the right return of something. What are you giving back? Not just what are you taking from, and that kind of principle, and finding the right balance. It's not a, you know, I used to love the Polaroid because it was a real true giving away of something, which is different than, you know, sending a digital file that you just took, even though I do that now. I know it's not the same thing as making that one and only single object of a Polaroid picture with an SX70 and saying, "This is for you," you know? It's really, and, you know, we kind of lose that in photography now in a funny way, because we feel by sharing files, which is a different kind of sharing, and that's important too. But
Yeah, I am a bit confused still about, you know, I was looking as well that how you, when you make a work, you really, you return the pictures to the place, you create exhibitions in the place, in other places with completely different audiences. Uh, they appear maybe in a story in a magazine. So it's all this amount, and I struggle with those because I started photography when the editorial was already going sort of
Right,
down, and
right.
never really completely understood the outcome. And I think now I'm starting to think more about it. But I wanted to ask you, the you've been working for a long time, and the editorial market, the magazines have changed.
Mm.
And I wanted to ask you how, perhaps, when is the most satisfactory moment for you when you share the work, in which place, or also
Yeah.
maybe uh, also how do you feel when it appeared, the stories of magazines, and the difference of how you feel maybe when got published before
Yes.
or now, like the story in Nicaragua the first time appear, or in comparison with something that you might do now. That
Oh, yeah. That's an entanglement of questions, but I think the heart
yeah, I know.
of it is, and actually, I don't think I would have known this, except that because I came into Magnum at a time where this network existed. You know, it wasn't my initiative, it was through my partnering and with magazines that, and I always say this because I didn't feel at the time I was working for magazines, but I was working with them because they were the means by which we could produce work. So the fact that work got reproduced was so significant. It just meant that I could stay longer and longer and longer, get the next airplane ticket or whatever, by building my own resources, not waiting for them to assign me. So that was a very particular time. It wasn't the glorious days of editorial. I mean, we always looked, my generation always looked at the people who came before us and said, wow, they got to go for 2 or 3 months places, and we had 2 to 3 weeks, but now you have 2 to 3 days if you have that. And generally you don't. So it's a huge change in the 40 plus years I've been working, huge. But I think that this idea of multi-platforming comes also from not thinking the media was the destination for the work. So if you go, the first time I work with any kind of media and I'm in magazines is through Nicaragua. And of course, because of the urgency of what's happening, it feels like the most appropriate medium at that time. If it was now, it would be Instagram, right? But because then you felt that people had to know what was happening and you had to find a way to get the film out. And so the trick then was to, you know, get your film out and stay, for me, because I didn't have resources to go back and forth. So I would find a courier, I would get my work out, Magnum would distribute the work, and various magazines might use it in different ways, and that became the economic stream. But I always thought I was going to pull that work together in some way. I didn't know it would become that there'd be a triumph in Nicaragua and that there would be a reason to have a book and onward shows. And here I am, you know, 40 years later, still showing that work. I mean, literally, I have a talk in a Zoom talk, and the next day talking about one photograph that ran in Life magazine. And I'm looking back at the original distro that Magnum edited because I wasn't back. I sent my exposed film. I'm looking at that set of 20 pictures and showing them how Life chose one picture and the Brazilian magazine Manchetti chose a completely different image. And I chose a third image when I put it in my book of the same series of photographs that were presented in the distro. So I kind of love this revisiting of a process. And of course, what I don't know was, why did Life choose that? Who was the editor? What were they thinking? You know, if you were really a historian of this field, you would want all of that, right? You'd want the notes and the debates and if there were any. But, you know, it was a very organic process for me to bring that work together. Some of it had been published. I basically felt no one understood that process. It was a very intense year of work. So bringing it together as a book with each image, I mean, this is something else about narrative, you know. a single image published, maybe you would be lucky to have a couple of spreads, which we rarely see now, though I just picked up the New York Times Magazine yesterday, and practically the whole magazine is given over to one photographer portraying the corona
Yeah.
virus and the patients in hospitals. And it's very rare to see that. You know, I've seen it. Paulo did something with refugees a few years ago, but you know, it's very rare. In any case, those multiple images, it's still very different when you make a book and you're telling subjectively, you know, your own story through the bits and pieces and fragments that you may have captured. You know, and as you know, for me, it wasn't just the cinematic narrative, but then contextualizing those photographs in the back of the book, so that's kind of a second reading. So finding and an exhibition is completely different. It's completely
Yeah,
different.
yeah, I see that you disseminated, that you are not scared at all of like going through the material and reinvent it and yeah, and reanalyze it. That's really interesting for me.
If you have it, you
Yeah,
know, I literally yesterday was looking for the original distro of this, around this one photograph that I'm going to talk about from Nicaragua. It was a scene of bombing of a family. Somoza dropped a bomb on a house and a number of houses in a neighborhood, and one of them was totally destroyed. There were 5 kids in the family, 2 of whom died. And I happened to be very close to when that actually happened. And so I'm looking at the one photograph, but reconstituting in some ways still is very partial. There's so much information missing. I keep thinking, why didn't I ask the name of the family? Why didn't I talk to the mother? I'm sure it's because it was in the middle of a war. I moved from one spot to another with very little security and not knowing, you know, where we were in time, you know.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think the richer your archive is, you know, I always encourage people, whether it's diaries that you keep or articles that inspire you to go places, or whatever the richness is that's in your own processing, or the bits and pieces that inform you along the way. It's
They
hugely
open up.
valuable going forward. You will be amazed. You're young enough to think you'll always remember everything. When you're where I am, I love finding things that bring back my memory, because otherwise it just escapes. It just disappears. Just
Yeah,
disappears.
I wanted also to ask you about. I come from a family where revolution is praised. No, it's like the fight against some as an oppressive structure is like something I've been taught of. No, and
Hey,
told.
you mean La Lucha Sigue or what? La Lucha Libre? What are you saying?
That I come from a family like it's like hasta la victoria siempre.
Yeah,
So
but we don't have a Victoria, so it will be siempre.
that's
I mean,
that is definitely true.
so the conditions now might be setting up some new revolutionary opportunities, or
Yeah,
certainly some
completely.
radical opportunities. I hope, at least in this country, I think a lot of social stress hopefully will lead to a recalibration, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of fight.
How are you feeling about the whole? Do you have any conclusion about how what's happening in the States, or is too soon, or
I just think you can't you can't be present through this process, staying and observant, and the question is, what's going to be the means by which significant change can happen in this country? That's a huge challenge. It's a legal challenge. It's a social movement challenge. Social movement, you know, was focused around a campaign, and it's going to move from a campaign through this crisis. It has to sustain itself with a vision. So I want to be hopeful. But I also think we're all in a very, you know, no one really has a sense of how deep and how dark this can still be. You know, we're all kind of wondering, you know, I mean, I have 2 shows that are postponed for an indefinite time. I have 2 publications that are small, but maybe they'll proceed, maybe they won't. It's hard to know. I mean, one in China and one in Italy. I love that the Italians think that their printing presses are essential workers, essential work sites. But, you know, these are the bookstores that mean that the whole system, the whole social structure is going to be reevaluated. I live 2 blocks from the Bowery, and the lines are longer and longer, the food lines.
Yeah.
So it's a very hard time to process, just to be alert, as alert as we can be.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of showing quite more obviously what is the most important sort of in the structure we live in. What is the most important things we need to protect, and it's showing things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's also about moving from protecting yourself, which is, you know, not the first thing I usually think about, but in this combination of protecting self or community, and then you know, strengthening community. And this is an example of strengthening community, you know, reaching out across in this zigzag way. Again, the zigzag is a better image I have than the linear progressive assumption. I think it's much more moving from protecting ourselves to seeing how interconnected we are, and then how do we create structures that have, you know, deal with this extraordinary inequality that is very present in the US, maybe in a different way than Europe.
Well, it's very present in the UK, definitely.
Yeah. And where do we place ourselves in that? And I think the other thing I'm thinking about, as much as frustrating as it is not to be able to really in any significant way contribute to the visualizing of this period, I'm also imagining in a way, the darker, longer response of, you know, the kind of invisibility of loss that we know is all around us, you know, and will be for a very long time.
Yeah, that's interesting, the invisibility of that, especially everyone being kept on their own bubble.
Yes, whether or not you think of it as at the level of, you know, children growing up in this environment, they're getting on one level the benefit of their family, of their parents, ideally, you know, they're more present than they would be if they're working. On the other hand, you have kids who are probably trapped in abusive situations, or women who might be. So, you know, I feel there's so much more we don't know about the long-term consequences of this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I got more questions. I got a bit lost. I was trying to ask you when, you know, to be involved in this the intensity of the energy of a revolution, or that type of fight, of that, you know, and I can be quite romantic with that as well. I know that.
For many of us were romantic at that time.
Yeah, I have.
It's harder to sustain the romanticism.
And I want to know how, and at that time, transformed your way of looking. And when you were back as well in the US, how, if it transformed your relationship or your vision of the US, or you already sort of.
I would just say it sort of deepened my understanding of the structures of power in American government, and, you know, heightened my, how would I say, you know, what was hard about that period is that I got further and further away from the US. At first, of course, the most difficult part was acknowledging I was an American. And even though I was a person and a citizen and not part of the government, I was assumed to be a spy in some places. And so working my own way through who am I as an American first, and then going really further and further south all the way to the cone, and spending a decade in and out of parts of Latin America through this period, the late 70s through the 80s. I would come back less and less to the US. I felt less and less like I could fully embrace the country of my origin, which I couldn't also deny, because I could see the way the structures of power were in place. So even though you could have the glorious moment of a revolution, and the taking on of true independence, I could try a struggle. This was also at the time of the Cold War. So, the powers were not just the US, it was this dynamic of the Cold War that was entrenching and entrapping the world dynamic. So I became more and more just sort of watching, looking at, trying to understand. I mean, I remember when I went to the Philippines, I literally had this naive idea that, and this was, I think, maybe around the time you were born, 86, somewhere in there,
Yeah.
Thinking that maybe the US would take its mind off of its assault on Central America, because it wasn't just Nicaragua, Salvador, and Guatemala, and move their eye elsewhere, to the Philippines. So I went to the Philippines literally to understand what was going on in the Philippines, to figure out what was. So it was like trying to follow the path of power as it operated. Anyway, yeah, long years ago, and so much has gone differently than one anticipated then.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sometimes I feel like it's an illusion that things are changing really fast. And other times I think, well, things are changing really fast. But sometimes I feel like things are like very cyclical, and I don't know, a bit suspicious of the illusion that things are changing really fast, like sometimes.
Yeah. Well, some things do happen very fast, but the ramifications take longer to reflect on and understand, where, I don't know if the image is a metaphor as a pendulum swing, people refer to that, or a spiral. Is it a, but it's, I have Google alerts on certain places where I daily am keeping track of what's happening in Kurdistan, what's happening in Nicaragua, Salvador, places that I've had long relationships with. And, I think the hardest thing is, though, we're so connected and we have all this information, but it's very hard to sustain the same level of engagement.
Yeah.
And so, what you let go of, what you keep, what you carry within, where you place yourself in time, over time. These are the hard questions for any photographer, because we only have the time we have, either to reflect on, to act upon.
Yeah.
So,
Muy
yeah.
bien. I don't
Our
know.
time is probably up. I think Bika, I
Yeah,
mean,
I think we don't.
launched us into a conversation that I hope we'll be able to continue. I mean, now that we've opened the little windows and doors, let's keep the flow.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. What did you watch the other conversations and everything?
I just watched the I loved watching Christina and Thomas recently.
Yeah, I love them
That
more.
exchange, and I do think, when Bika first had this idea, I thought, oh, okay, well, whatever. And I think it's brilliant, because I think this is what we all know, is that we can live with people who we think we know, who we don't really know, and under certain circumstances we get to know better. So I love that. In another hour we're going to have our community cocktail, which is kind of lunch for me, so it's not exactly I'm going to be drinking, but I love that we see lots of little faces, even if it's the illusion of connectedness. It's not the depth of what we know to be really truly connected is, but it's more than a gesture. I think it can be more deeply meaningful, actually, to know that there's a world out there that is further distant, that you don't know at all, but those that you carry relationships onward in one way, through your memory of people, through your interactions. So I'm very glad we're doing it. Yeah.
Sí,
I'm really glad that you were randomly selected, Lua.
Sí,
I really am. So I just hope you let yourself get lost. I want you to get lost, because only you can find your true self. So let yourself trust yourself, as they say. I really hope you will, because you'll take all of us with you on that journey in some way.
Thank you. I'm really also really glad we had this conversation, and I'm also looking forward to continue.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Next time, I hope there'll be a reverse. I get to ask you questions.
Oh, that's nice as well. I like that too.
Yeah.
Nice, Susan. So see you in a little bit again.
Pronto. Okay.
Muy bien. Hasta ahora.
Besos.
Un beso.
Ciao. Ciao.
Ciao.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Susan and Lua for the last conversation. And here we go then. So the next photographer who will ask the questions is Prestil Perkins. And the one who will answer those questions, Jean Goumi. Wonderful. Good luck. Bye-bye.